Everyone knows the Rothschilds, the banking dynasty that financed wars, toppled kings, and built fortunes so vast they became synonymous with wealth itself. But there was another family, just as powerful, just as ruthless, just as connected to the machinery of empire. They operated not in the marble halls of Frankfurt or London, but in the sweltering ports of Bombay, the opium dens of Canton, and the counting houses of Shanghai. They were called the Sassoons, and history tried very hard to forget them. Welcome to the Fiscal blueprint, where the real engines of power leave paper trails, not monuments. The Sassoon story does not begin with wealth. It begins with exile. Baghdad, 1828. The Ottoman Empire is fracturing. Local governors are seizing power. Old alliances are worthless. And a Jewish family that had served as treasurers to the pashas for generations suddenly finds itself on the wrong side of a political purge. David Sassoon watched his world collapse in a matter of weeks. His father had managed the finances of Baghdad's governor for decades. The Sassoons were respected, wealthy, deeply embedded in the commercial networks stretching from Basra to Persia. None of it mattered when the new governor decided Jewish influence had grown too large. Persecution came fast. Property was seized, businesses were shuttered, and friends disappeared. David gathered his family, whatever gold he could hide, and fled east toward the Persian Gulf. He was 36 years old. He had 8 children. He had no country, no protection, and no future. What he did have was knowledge. David Sassoon understood trade routes the way a general understands battlefields. He knew which goods moved through which ports. He knew which currencies held value and which were collapsing. He knew that the British East India Company was consolidating control over the Indian subcontinent, and that their hunger for commerce was bottomless. He arrived in Bombay in 1832. It was not a glamorous destination. Bombay was a humid, chaotic colonial outpost, a transit point for cotton and textiles heading to Britain's industrial mills. But David saw what others missed. Bombay was a choke point. Everything moving between Britain and Asia passed through its harbor. Whoever controlled the trade flowing through that port controlled the commercial artery of the largest empire on earth. He started small. Cotton, yarn, basic textiles. He worked 8-hour days, learned English, Hindustani, and Cantonese. He built relationships with British officers, Indian merchants, Parsi traders, and Arab ship owners. Within 5 years, David Sassoon and Company was one of the largest trading firms in Western India. But cotton was not going to build an empire. Opium was. The British had a problem. They wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But China wanted almost nothing Britain produced. The trade imbalance was catastrophic. Silver was draining out of British coffers into Chinese treasuries at an unsustainable rate. The solution was elegant and monstrous. Britain would grow opium in India, ship it to China, and use the proceeds to buy Chinese goods. The drug would create its own demand. Addiction would guarantee repeat customers. The Chinese government banned opium imports. Britain didn't care. China tried to enforce the ban. Britain sent warships. The Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 were not fought over territory or ideology. They were fought to protect drug trafficking profits. And David Sassoon was paying attention. He did not run opium dens. He did not captain smuggling ships. He operated at a higher level. David Sassoon and Company became the logistics backbone of the opium trade. They financed shipments. They insured cargoes. They warehoused product. They provided the credit that allowed smaller merchants to operate. They were the infrastructure. By the 1850s, Sassoon ships were carrying thousands of chests of opium annually from Indian ports to Chinese buyers. The numbers were staggering. A single chest of opium sold for roughly 400 rupees in Bombay. In Canton, it fetched over 1,000. The margins were enormous, and David Sassoon captured them at every stage of the supply chain. His critics called him a drug lord in a silk coat. His defenders pointed out that he was doing exactly what the British Empire sanctioned, encouraged and protected with military force. Both were correct. The mechanics of the opium trade reveal how deeply the Sassoons embedded themselves into imperial commerce. Indian farmers grew poppies under contracts enforced by British authorities. The raw opium was processed in government-licensed factories in Patna and Benares. Auctions were held in Calcutta, where trading houses bid for chests of processed opium. This is where Sassoon capital entered the chain. David Sassoon and Company purchased opium at auction, arranged shipping to coastal depots, and then financed the final leg to Chinese ports. At each stage, they took a cut. Financing fees, insurance premiums, warehousing charges, currency exchange margins. They never touched the drug themselves. They touched the money that moved the drug. This distinction mattered legally and reputationally. The Sassoons could claim they were bankers and merchants, not smugglers. But the prophets told a different story. But David Sassoon was not building wealth for its own sake. He was building permanence. Every rupee earned from opium was reinvested into tangible assets: mills, warehouses, docks, real estate. He constructed the Sassoon Docks in Bombay, still operational today. He built synagogues, hospitals, and schools across India. He funded infrastructure that would outlast the trade that paid for it. This was the Sassoon model: extract wealth from volatile commerce, convert it into permanent assets. Repeat. And he did something else that would define the dynasty for generations. He deployed his sons like chess pieces across the map of empire. Elias went to China. Abdullah went to London. Reuben managed operations in Bombay. Other sons established branches in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Baghdad. Each son was not just a trader. He was an intelligence node in a global network. When cotton prices shifted in Manchester, the Sassoons knew within days. When silver flows changed in Canton, they adjusted their positions before competitors understood what was happening. Information moved through family channels faster than it moved through official ones. By the time David Sassoon died in 1864, his empire stretched across 3 continents. His sons inherited not just wealth, but a machine. Elias David Sassoon took the China operation and transformed it into something even larger. Shanghai in the 1870s was the Wild West of global finance. Half a dozen foreign powers had carved out concessions in the city. Banks and brothels operated side by side. Fortunes were made and lost in single afternoons. Elias built warehouses on the Bund, Shanghai's famous waterfront. He established E.D. Sassoon and Company as one of the dominant trading houses in Asia. The Bund itself was a monument to foreign capital. British banks, French trading houses, American insurance companies, and Japanese shipping firms lined the waterfront in a row of neoclassical buildings that looked transplanted from European capitals. The Sassoons understood that in Shanghai, real estate was not just investment. It was power. Whoever owned the buildings on the Bund controlled the commercial infrastructure of East Asia's most important port. Elias acquired property systematically: office buildings, warehouses, hotels, residential blocks. By 1900, the Sassoon family owned more prime Shanghai real estate than any other foreign entity. But he also saw that the opium trade was changing. Chinese domestic production was increasing. International pressure was mounting. The margins were shrinking. So Elias pivoted. Real estate, banking, insurance, shipping. The Sassoons stopped being opium merchants and became financiers. They provided credit to other traders. They invested in railways and telegraph lines. They bought land in Shanghai that would appreciate for decades. By the 1880s, journalists were calling them the Rothschilds of the East. The comparison was apt. Both families had turned refugee status into global financial power. Both operated across borders as if nations were inconveniences. Both understood that the real power in capitalism is not holding assets, but controlling flows. Meanwhile, Abdullah Sassoon had taken the London operation in a different direction entirely. He cultivated relationships with British aristocracy. He donated to museums and universities. He built estates that rivaled those of English lords. In 1890, Queen Victoria knighted him. Think about that trajectory for a moment. 60 years earlier, his father had fled Baghdad as a persecuted refugee. Now his son was receiving honors from the most powerful monarch on earth. The Sassoons had not just survived, they had conquered the system that once excluded them. But the 20th century was coming, and it would test every assumption the dynasty had built. The first blow came from opium itself. By 1900, international pressure to end the trade was overwhelming. Missionaries, journalists, and reformers had turned public opinion against the drug. The British government, facing criticism at home and abroad, began restricting exports. The Sassoons had already diversified, but the reputational damage lingered. The family that had built hospitals and synagogues was also the family that had profited from mass addiction. History does not forget selectively. The second blow came from the Great Depression. The crash of 1929 devastated global trade. Shipping volumes collapsed. Real estate values cratered. Credit markets froze. The Sassoon businesses survived, but they never recovered their former dominance. Worse, the world was changing beneath them. The age of family dynasties was ending. Corporations were replacing partnerships. Professional managers were replacing patriarchs. The trust networks that had given the Sassoons their edge were becoming obsolete. You could now wire money across the globe in minutes. You didn't need a cousin in Shanghai to know what was happening there. The third blow came from politics. In China, the Communist Revolution of 1949 nationalized foreign assets. The Sassoon properties in Shanghai, accumulated over nearly a century, were seized overnight. In India, independence in 1947 brought new regulations, new taxes, and new skepticism of colonial era fortunes. In Britain, the post-war welfare state changed the rules of wealth preservation. The empire the Sassoons had served no longer existed. The world they had mastered had been replaced. By the 1960s, the Sassoon name had faded from the financial headlines. Their companies had been absorbed into larger institutions. Their family members had scattered into academia, philanthropy, and obscurity. The dynasty that had once rivaled the Rothschilds became a historical footnote. But their legacy did not disappear. It transformed. Walk through Shanghai today, and you will see their fingerprints everywhere. The Peace Hotel in the Bund was originally Sassoon House. It's built in 1929 as the headquarters of their China operations. Victor Sassoon, the last great patriarch of the dynasty, constructed this building as a monument to the family's dominance. It featured a rooftop restaurant, a jazz bar, and private suites for visiting dignitaries. The green copper pyramid on its roof became one of Shanghai's most recognizable landmarks. Victor threw legendary parties there. Movie stars, diplomats, and industrialists mingled in ballrooms, while revolutionary armies gathered in the countryside. He seemed to believe the party would never end. When the communists took Shanghai in 1949, Victor was in the Bahamas. He never returned to China. His properties, accumulated over 3 generations, were nationalized without compensation. Walk through Mumbai and you will find the Sassoon Docks still handling cargo. The Sassoon Library still lending books. The David Sassoon Hospital still treating patients. Walk through the architecture of global capitalism and you will find their blueprint embedded in the walls. Because what the Sassoons proved was that capital does not need citizenship. They operated across empires, religions, and legal systems. They turned exile into advantage, outsider status into flexibility. They understood that the real borders in capitalism are not geographic. They are informational. Whoever moves intelligence faster wins. This model did not die with them. It evolved. Modern multinational corporations operate on identical principles. Amazon does not belong to any single nation. Apple manufactures in China, incorporates in Ireland, and sells everywhere. BlackRock manages more assets than most countries produce in a year. These entities are the Sassoons scaled up and stripped of family drama. They control flows rather than assets. They profit from imbalance. They exist in the gaps between jurisdictions where regulation cannot reach. The Sassoons would recognize them immediately. They would also recognize the vulnerabilities. It's because every system built on imbalance eventually faces correction. The Sassoons rose when empires were expanding and borders were permeable. They fell when nationalism surged, when revolution redrew maps, when the rules changed faster than they could adapt. The same forces are gathering today. Governments are reasserting control over capital flows. Nationalism is rising across continents. Technology that once empowered borderless commerce is now being weaponized for surveillance and control. The next generation of Sassoons, whoever they are, will face the same test. Can they adapt when the system that created them begins to collapse? History suggests the answer is rarely yes. Dynasties are built on specific conditions. When those conditions change, the dynasty either transforms or dies. The Sassoons transformed once, from opium merchants to financiers. They could not transform again when the entire imperial system that sustained them disappeared. Their story is not a tragedy. It is a lesson. Wealth built on imbalance is always temporary. Empires that seem permanent are always fragile. Families that seem untouchable are always one revolution away from irrelevance. The Sassoons understood this better than most. They built schools and hospitals and docks precisely because they knew that trade could vanish overnight, but infrastructure endures. They were right about that. Their buildings still stand. Their name is carved into stone across 3 continents, but the dynasty itself is gone. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Money can buy permanence for your monuments. It cannot buy permanence for your bloodline. The ledger of history records everything. Fortunes, the philanthropy, the opium, the exile. It does not judge, it simply remembers. And it always collects. If this changed how you see the machinery of empire, hit subscribe. The fiscal blueprint is just getting started.